let's talk about the idea that perceiving is for doing. So that priming doesn't only activate specific judgments in us, but also leads to behavioral consequences. And an example of this might be what we would call ideomotor action. So thinking about or perceiving something increases the likelihood that you will actually do it. So the idea is that the mental content when perceiving certain parts of our social environment automatically creates some behavioral tendencies. So perceiving X or thinking about X gets you to be more likely to do X. For instance, if you imagine making a certain motion with your hand, whether you actually do that motion with your hand or you just think about it, shares some activation in the brain regions that are involved in both of these things. So regions that serve the execution of the movement are activated, but also during just imagining making that movement. This would be an example, of course, of perceiving something and then the setup in our brain being ready to roll for putting it into action, for doing. Now let's take a look at where this idea of perceiving is for doing was also tested in some research. Here I have an example where again we have a scrambled sentences task. So remember that from the last video. And this time the scrambled sentences were either about politeness words or about control words or about words that had to do with rudeness. So we have three different conditions here. We have a control and one where people should be more inclined to be polite, and one condition where people should be more inclined to be rude. And then participants, after working through these scrambled sentences, were asked to contact the experimenter who was ostensibly busy. And our dependent variable here is the time that it took until participants would interrupt the experimenter with whatever thing that they were busy with. So what would you expect? You would expect that participants who are primed with the idea of politeness would wait longer to intervene than participants who are primed with rudeness. And if we look at the results for the study, that's exactly what we see. So we see that on the y-axis we have the let's not look at the graph, but let's only look at the times for now that are on the left of this. So the time to interruption, you can see, is the shortest for participants who were primed with rudeness or hostility, then medium for participants in the control condition, and the longest, or potentially not different from control, but the longest for participants in the politeness priming group. Now let's look at the graph. And here we have on the y-axis the percentage of participants who actually did interrupt the experimenter who was ostensibly busy. And not everyone interrupted, as you can see from this graph. But we can look at the differences in the percentages of people who did interrupt the experimenter. And we can do this depending on the priming condition, which are on the x-axis. So we have the politeness condition, and there you have the fewest percentage of people who interrupted, and the neutral condition that was in between, and then in the rudeness or hostility condition, those were their participants were the most likely to interrupt the experimenter. Okay, and this would be evidence that perceiving is for doing. So being primed with the concept of politeness makes people less likely to act in a rude way and more likely to act in a polite way, which is not interrupting the experimenter. But being primed with the concept of rudeness makes people more likely to act in a rude way. Another experiment where that idea was put to the test, that perceiving is for doing, and now we're moving in the direction of looking at stereotypes. So another experiment was this. So first participants went through a task where they saw pictures of 4 to 25 different colored circles inside a small box on the screen. And they were shown a few seconds at a time, and each time the participant had to guess if there was an odd or an even number of circles. And then so they worked through this experiment, but in the end, after this 130 trial long task, participants were interrupted with an ostensible error that was shown on the computer screen. It said system error, and just before this error message was shown, there was a subliminal presentation of either a white or a black person's face. What do I mean by subliminal? I mean by that it was presented so quickly that it couldn't reach participants' conscious perception, but it was presented. Okay, so after this error message was shown, then the experimenter came and said that, oh, it seems like the computer did not save your data from the task before that. I'm so sorry, but you'll have to do the experiment over again. And then the experimenter fiddled some more with the computer and then said, oh, well, actually, it looks like the computer did save your data. Phew, lucky you don't have to do it over. You don't have to do the experiment over again. And while this occurred, participants were videotaped, and our dependent variable in this study is the reactions to the news that they might have to do the task over again. So we have basically ratings of participants' facial expressions and otherwise of their reactions while they were told that they would have to do this task over again. And we can condition these reactions on whether they were subliminally shown the face of a black or of a white person before before they interacted with the experimenter. So if we look at the data, we have here the hostility ratings of participants' reactions. So this is not participants themselves saying how hostile they felt, but this is someone rating the videotape of the participant in their reaction to the experimenter, right? So the hostility ratings of participants' reactions, first of all, by the experimenter themselves. What did the experimenter feel, how hostile the person was to them? Those are the left two bars. And then blind coders on the right two bars who didn't know which condition the participant was in, if they saw a Caucasian or a black person's face before interacting with the experimenter, right? We have in dark blue the prime type as the African American person's face, and you can see that the hostility ratings were higher both for experimenters and blind coders, were higher, but if the prime that was shown previous to the interaction with the experimenter was a African American person's face, as compared to in the white bars a Caucasian person's face. So this would be evidence that participants were primed with the concept of hostility as from the stereotype of a black versus white person, and then that this hostility prime, carried over into their behavior and the behavior towards the experimenter, such that both the experimenter and blind coders picked up on different levels of hostility in their behavior. Another example of the idea that behavioral priming is a thing, so that perceiving is for doing, is the case of the Florida study, which is, I think, by now pretty famous. And here, participants unscrambled sentences that dealt with elderly stereotypes. So they were primed with concepts like Florida, which famously houses lots of elderly people, wrinkles, and old, or they were primed with neutral words. And then our dependent variable in this study was the time that it took subjects to walk to the elevator, from the room where the experiment was to the elevator, about 10 meters. So there was an experimenter standing there timing how fast participants walked. And the idea here is that perceiving is for doing. So perceiving and activating stereotypes about the elderly would make people walk more slowly, like elderly people. And here are the results of this study. And actually in two experiments, we have the mean time it took participants to walk to the elevator, these about 10 meters that they walked. Depending on the priming condition, in black bars are the elderly primed participants, and in white, the participants who didn't have the elderly priming, so who had like a neutral text to read or like neutral sentences to unscramble. And what you can see is that participants who were primed with the elderly words, they walked more slowly. They took longer to reach the elevator than participants in the neutral condition. So at least that's the evidence from the original study. There is a follow-up, or there was a follow-up to this much later, 2012, where actually instead of timing this by hand, experimenters put up infrared sensors to measure how long it took participants to walk from the experimentation room through the hallway. Same length, so also about 10 meters. So this was a more objective way of measuring the walking speed compared to someone using a stopwatch. If you have infrared light sensors, that would be the more objective way. And here is the data for the prime versus no prime conditions. So in light blue, this would be the elderly primed people. Those would be the ones we would expect to walk more slowly. And in dark blue, those would be the participants who were in the no prime or the neutral condition. That's kind of our baseline. What you can see here, though, is that there's actually no evidence that these two groups walked at a different speed. So in this replication attempt, the original finding that the Florida primed people would walk more slowly couldn't be replicated. What's more, in this follow-up study, in this replication study, 10 participants were actually recruited to act as experimenters, and they were walked through the experimental paradigm and were then led to believe that either it was to be expected that participants would walk more slowly or would walk faster. So the experimenters expected some of the participants to walk more slowly and some of the participants to walk faster. And each of these 10 experimenters then tested 5 participants. Now we can take a look at the difference between the objective timing with the infrared sensors and the subjective timing by these 10 participants turned experimenters who had, for timing purposes, only a stopwatch. So here is the graph of that. We have on the left the subjective timings. Those are the ones by the participants turned experimenters, right? Who had an expectation about whether someone should walk more slowly or faster. So if we look at the results of what happens if you actually give the experimenters an expectation about the behavior of participants in the priming condition, we can consult this graph. So on the left side, we have the subjective timing. So this is the experimenters with an expectation timing manually our participants in terms of their walking speed. And what you can see is that we have in the no prime condition, so where participants weren't primed with the Florida words, here in the subjective timing condition, our experimenters, the ones with the expectation, right, they actually don't produce an effect for different walking speeds, or at least there's framed differently. The walking speeds are very similar in the no prime condition for subjective timings. However, for subjective timings, if there is a prime, and so experimenters know that participants have been primed, they actually, in their timings, they produce this effect. So they produce, if they were led to believe that the prime would make people walk more slowly, they produce timings that are longer, so slower walking, than in the condition where they've been led to believe that the prime would make participants walk more quickly. So basically, experimenters here produce timings that were in accordance with their beliefs about what participants would be doing. If we look at the objective primings, we can see that objectively, so this is the infrared light sensor timings, objectively, participants did walk more slowly if experimenters were led to believe that they should walk more slowly. So there was something in their interaction, or also, something in their interaction with the experimenter that led participants to walk more slowly. But this was the case both in the no prime and in the prime condition, compared to where participants were supposed to be led to believe that experimenters were led to believe that participants would walk more slowly. Right? So it seems like there is an effect of this priming, and it's somewhere, it's all in the mind, but in whose mind? And rather, it seems like this effect is in the mind of the experimenter who has a belief about what should be happening.